I'm Joe Knight. I'm Communications Officer for the Lenfest Ocean Program. Just some logistics. I can be reached at 202-552-2070 or on my cell, which is 202-664-4504. My email address is jknight, that's JKNIGHT, at pewtrust.org. And today we will be hearing from Dr. Tim Essington. He's an associate professor at the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington. Dr. Essington's first name is Tim, and his last name is spelled Essington. He can be reached for follow-up after this call at 206-335-9578. We are very pleased to have him join us to talk about the findings of his research on the ecological impacts of catch share programs on fisheries and in the U.S. on fisheries in the U.S. and Canada. But first, let me give you a little bit of background information. For those of you who may be new to this issue, a catch share program is a fishery management system that divides up or allocates percentages or shares of the total allowable catch to individual fishermen or fishing groups. There are several types and several names for catch share programs. Some include individual transferable quotas, individual fishing quotas, limited access privilege programs, sector allocations, and enterprise allocations. This study was funded by the Lenfest Ocean Program. Lenfest is spelled Lenfest. Our website is www.lenfestocean.org. The Lenfest Ocean Program supports scientific research aimed at helping decision makers understand the causes and consequences of challenges facing the global marine environment. It also supports scientific research to help decision makers design and implement policies that will sustainably manage ocean ecosystems. The Lenfest Ocean Program studied this study on the ecological impacts of catch share programs because governments around the world have been turning to these types of fishery management systems, typically with the goal of improving the health of their fisheries. The Lenfest Ocean Program thought it was important to understand whether these catch shares actually do lead to larger and healthier fish populations. Dr. Essington's study is being published by the peer-reviewed journal, The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It is being published this week, and the embargo on stories about the study lifts today at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Apparently there is a copy of the study at Eureka Alert, and you can go to that site to obtain a copy. The publication of the study is actually very timely because the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released its draft policy on the use of catch share programs in fishery management plans on December 10th. According to NOAA's website, the draft policy, quote, encourages well-designed catch share programs to help rebuild fisheries and sustain fishermen, communities, and vibrant working waterfronts, end quote. A public comment period on the draft policy is open until April 10th, 2010. And if you want more information on this draft policy, you can go to their website. It's www.nmfs, for National Marine Fisheries Service, .noaa.gov. And that's just a little bit of background information. Now I will turn the call over to Dr. Essington, who will give us a brief explanation of the findings of his research. And then we will open up the call for question and answer. So Dr. Essington?
All right. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, everyone, for calling in. I have just a brief summary of the paper that I'll give, and I wanted to start off just by saying up front that I'm not going to say that catch shares are a great idea or a terrible idea or how best to implement them. And the reason why is my training is as an ecologist, so that's really been the focus of my study. And as Joe mentioned, and many of you are probably aware, that catch shares have been widely touted as a way for more effective governance of marine fisheries. And there are many elements why people believe that these programs might promote long-term sustainable use, but a central one from an ecological perspective is the idea that they create stewardship incentives. The basic idea is that if someone has a dedicated access to some fraction of the resource to harvest, they should have some incentive to make sure that resource is in good shape. Now, of course, like all policy instruments, they're devised by and used by humans to govern and shape human behavior. And my group is really interested in a fisheye view of catch shares. So we ask the question, given these changes in incentives that catch shares may provide, do we see parallel changes in the state or status of marine populations and ecosystems? Now, there have been a few attempts to ask really similar questions. These previous works used really different measures and methods and ended up reaching fairly different conclusions. There was the fairly well-publicized paper by Chris Costello and his colleagues, and that group found that large declines in catches were far less likely in catch share fisheries than in other fisheries. But a separate study conducted by Cindy Chu, rather than looked at the landings, they actually looked at estimates of the sizes of fish populations. And she found little evidence for changes in the total amount of fish in the ocean or in the trends following putting in catch shares. And I think these divergent conclusions reveal a fundamental scientific challenge, that is trying to get this fisheye view of the world is made really difficult because there's no single measure that can really tell us that much about ecological conditions. And this is not unlike the way we gauge performance of a lot of athletes, for instance. So if we think of like a major league pitcher, there's a whole suite of statistics that we keep track of to sort of gauge whether one pitcher is better than another. So we might look at the total number of wins, the total number of strikeouts per game, the total number of runs given up per game. All these tell us a little bit something different about how good that particular pitcher is. So my group really tried to use a similar approach in that rather than picking a single measure, we tried to use as many ecologically relevant indicators that we could find data on. And the indicators that we ended up focusing on included things like measures that tell us something about the health of the fish stock or fish population. We wanted to look at how closely does the fisheries catches actually match the catch quota, so were they able to avoid catch overages. We looked at how much habitat-destroying effort was used in some fisheries, and we looked at how much wasteful discarding of fish happens, typically because on low-valued fish, they might be put back into the ocean. And then, in addition to these fairly direct ecological measures, we also wanted to look at the catches themselves to determine whether catch shares change the production capacity of fishery systems. And I think because of this breadth, this analysis is one of the more comprehensive analyses to date because we looked at a variety of different indicators rather than a single one. And in the end, I ended up comparing 15 North American fisheries, and we did these comparisons in several different ways, but we often tried to make direct comparisons of a catch share fishery to a very similar fishery that operated nearby that were not in catch shares. And by doing that, we're able to gauge how these indicators change in response to catch shares. And what I found was completely unexpected to me. Across all the indicators that we looked at, there was no change in the average levels following catch share implementation. However, we did find that the catch shares did behave quite a bit differently in that they became a lot less variable from year to year. And then the way I like to think about this is again drawing an analogy to this major league pitcher I was talking about before. And suppose you had a pitcher who on average gives up 4 runs per game, but he's also very erratic. So some games he's great, he doesn't allow any runs. Other games he's terrible, and he ends up getting 10 or 12 runs. So the team brings in a new pitching coach, and they change all sorts of elements of his mechanics and his preparation. And after this new coaching, he still ends up giving up 4 runs per game. So the average level didn't change at all. But suppose this coaching ended up preventing these terrible games, so he no longer gives up 10 or 12 runs. And it also turns out he never has these outstanding games either. He never has pitches these shutouts. Instead, he tends to give up the same number of runs every game, but the average didn't change. And that's essentially what catch shares ended up doing in the 15 North American fisheries that we analyzed here. For all but one of the indicators, there was no strong change in the average level of those indicators. So, for instance, population status generally was unchanged by catch shares. The total amount of fish caught did not go up and did not go down. But for all the indicators that we looked at, there were sharp reductions in the interannual variability, meaning they tended to have very small fluctuations from year to year. And for many of these indications, they were so strong that we were able to deem them to be significant. So from this, our main conclusions that the paper draws is that the primary benefit from catch shares in these fisheries was to make the fisheries more stable and more consistent from year to year, and that they did not lead to widespread improvements in ecological status. Now, given the current push, certainly in the United States, but then also in Canada, to implement more catch shares, I think these findings have two important contributions. The first is that it identifies some real limits of catch shares with respect to changing ecological conditions. And some of those limits in hindsight were fairly obvious, but it's easy to lose sight of these. And the second, and perhaps the most important contribution, is they help clarify what we might expect to gain from a catch share fisheries. And what I mean by that is that if we understand the type of responses that catch shares produce, we can better identify fisheries where they will be most helpful. So if a problem in a fishery is that the fleet behavior is very erratic and it's very unpredictable from year to year, catch shares might be a highly effective tool to improve that fishery. So that concludes my summary of the paper.